Hey all, Alex here at your home of the Music Deep Dive, and today it is time for a review of the 1865 novel by Jules Verne, From the Earth to the Moon, a direct route in 97 hours, 20 minutes. This is the third novel of Verne's that we are reviewing on this channel, his fourth novel overall, I believe, and this is the first one to be centered around this group of folks known as the Baltimore Gun Club, this sort of satirization of American sort of scientists and war enthusiasts, I suppose, which become a central group of characters for several of Verne's other novels to come as well. And From the Earth to the Moon is another one of Verne's most well-known novels, and one that I think has had kind of a long-standing sense of cultural import because of the movement that it preceded, I suppose. This work has been, it wasn't by no means the first novel to talk about humans going to space or humans going to the moon specifically. But out of all the novels that are dated kind of from around this era, this is the one that when scientists have looked back on it over time, especially after the actual, space race of the 1950s and 1960s. This is the one that has aged the best in a lot of ways. And a lot of people have written about how Verne's scientific research, based off of whatever information was available, ended up leading him to some fairly accurate conclusions and accuracies as far as how the trajectories and the calculations were created for actually launching man to the moon, the location of where such a launch needed to happen, that sort of thing, all ended up being actually very accurate to what the Americans specifically would end up doing, in the sense of trying to find a space near kind of the equator as far south as you could reasonably go, in order to be able to launch and reach the optimal escape velocity. So the reputation of this novel is remarkable, and I think, from a scientific standpoint, it's probably stands to reason that this is the most impressive Verne accomplishment so far, and possibly just in general, just because of that piece. And that doesn't necessarily mean that everything he does is accurate, of course. Again, there's limitations as far as what information was available from a physics standpoint in the 1860s, and ultimately, and a point that the person who writes the introduction in the volume that I read makes a good point about is, it's interesting that Verne, despite being aware of rocket technology, like humans knew what rockets were in the 1860s, even though man had not actually boarded one and would not board one for many years afterwards. It's interesting that Verne's conclusion was not to go the rocket route, but to go the cannon route, essentially. That ultimately the humans in this story are essentially shot out of this big-ass cannon, and that's how they get to the moon. Never mind the fact that the actual force on the humans, as they're being shot out of this cannon, if they need to escape the gravitational pull, would just totally obliterate the humans inside of it. So that's one small inaccuracy, but apart from that, it's impressive for what it is. Now, I knew that reputation going in, and I was curious to see how the story would be explored. And I guess this is very different from a pacing standpoint compared to the other Verne novels that I read so far. 5 Weeks in a Balloon and Journey to the Center of the Earth, in the sense of this book is not really about the adventure piece of it. This book is really about the preparation. And I mean, the entirety of the book is about the preparation. And in that sense, on the one hand, maybe if you're someone who's going into this thinking, oh, this is going to be an interesting exploration of how humans would interact in space, how people in the 1860s perceived and visioned these kind of interactions to be. I think if you're going into that with those expectations, you're going to walk away disappointed. There's another novel that Verne wrote as a sequel to this called Around the Moon, which talks about that side of it. I have not actually read that. I'm not entirely sure if I'm going to review it as part of this channel, since it's a lot less well known in the grand scheme of things, but worth knowing if you want that side of Verne. He did write a sequel to this novel that talks about it. This one, From the Earth to the Moon, really talks about the preparation piece, about the planning, and about a lot of the kind of like political maneuvering that goes on, in the sense of trying to get the country on board, trying to carve out the appropriate location, as I said, figuring out like what the expenses are going to be, and eventually getting the idea of, hey, you know, we were going to just send a craft to the moon, but now let's actually put someone in there. And then you have the sort of French daredevil scientist who's coming in and is volunteering to play that role. It's very interesting. And because of that, even though the novel by definition is a lot more kind of anodyne, I suppose, a lot more bland in terms of content than the other two Verne novels, it does also show off a side of Verne's writing that I think is very interesting. And part of that, I think, is the humor. Compared to the other Verne novels, which I think had some humor to them, certainly, but they were not obviously apparent. This one, I think, is very clearly going for a satirization element in a lot of cases. All the scenes, because it's based in America, right? It's the Baltimore Gun Club based in Baltimore. And so because of this, and because this is meant to be kind of in, you know, released in the aftermath of the American Civil War, and it was written during, you know, the ending months of the Civil War, the result is you have this like portrayal of Americans here as very, you know, kind of foolhardy, like folks who are like full of kind of bravado and full of kind of aggression and full of the impulse to like fight. That's the whole bit. The Baltimore Gun Club is built upon this idea of like, we are constantly fighting, we are constantly at war, and when we're not at war with anybody, we don't know what to do with ourselves. And it's very telling in that sense how the United States was viewed on kind of a global scale at that point. And Verne, I think, has a lot of fun with that portrayal, and especially when the again, when the French scientist comes in, you know, I'm not going to say he's a stand-in for Verne in that case, but you get to have some fun with him and his interactions with the Americans as well. And, you know, for as much as, you can say to a degree that this is a satire that I think has held up fairly well as far as, again, how Americans are perceived in the world consciousness. And that was an element I was not really expecting going in, and I was very amused by it, I have to say. So it's again, this is kind of a novel where nothing really happens, where not a whole lot happens until very close to the end. Because again, it is just kind of a lot of buildup. And in that sense, I think if you're looking for something that is action-packed in the way that some of those other Verne novels I mentioned were, you're not going to get that here. But seeing, again, the kind of the satirical piece, and again, if you're interested in Verne as scientific enthusiast, as someone who is really interested and does the legwork to build these calculations and kind of set the scene in a way that is accurate to our understanding at that point, if you're interested in that side of Verne, this is a very worthwhile novel to check out, I think. Not his most thrilling work by any stretch, but I would say very solidly enjoyable. Very, again, kind of interesting take on the whole deal. And I'm curious, again, not sure if I'll review it for the channel, but Around the Moon as kind of the sequel to it, where you actually get to see kind of the adventure side of it. I'm very curious to see at some point how that interacts with this one. Because it does feel like the two are meant to be kind of read as a pairing rather than this one in isolation. It feels like it always was created with some sort of element to reading them as a duo. Although that said, I do like the kind of uncertain ending of this one, and I think it does work to some degree in isolation. Just again, understand kind of what you're getting into when you start reading it. So From the Earth to the Moon, I would recommend it. Maybe not my first Verne novel that I would recommend to people, but it's good. It's enjoyable. It's interesting for what it is. And again, very ahead of its time. Very ahead of its time. With that, I want to say thank you all so much for watching. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. As always, more reviews are to come. Make sure to hit that bell for notifications and tell a friend as well. Thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time right here at your home of the Music Deep Dive.